Good evening, everybody. I am Matthew McMullen. I'm the SMA Central Regional Director. Tonight we'll be speaking about Equity's MOU, short for the Memorandum of Understanding Governing Employment in Business, Theater, and Events. We'll be talking with Richard Shavzin. He's a Equity Central Regional Board member. He's also involved in the leadership of SAG-AFTRA, and he's also on the Business, Theater, and Events Committee. And so I'm going to do a brief handoff to Katrina, and then we will begin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm just going to start us off with the land acknowledgement. We recognize that Chicago, Illinois sits on native land. As an example, the lands that the League of Chicago Theaters offices resides on is the traditional homelands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami. These tribes were forcibly removed from this land with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, leading to poverty, starvation, and death for many of their tribe members. We must also acknowledge that this land was a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. We honor these tribes and recognize that the occupation of their land is what has made this industry and community's existence possible. If you'd like to figure out what tribes lived on your land, you can go to nativeland.ca. And thank you to Steppenwolf Theater Company and the Chi-Art Census for this language. And next up, the Black Labor Acknowledgement. We recognize that the United States as we know it today was built at the often fatal expense of forcefully enslaved Black people. We acknowledge and remember those who did not survive the Middle Passage, those who were beaten and lynched at the hands of white Americans, and those who died and are still dying while fighting for their freedom. We remember those who toiled the grounds where many theaters have been built and resurrected. We acknowledge that while fighting for their own lives and civil liberties, Black people have envisioned a world that will be better for all of humanity. And thank you to R. Christopher Maxwell and the Black Theater Caucus, as well as the authors of the We See You Watt Demands for providing the framework for this language.
Thank you, Katrina. All right, so yeah, let's dive in here. It's a great group. It's very national group. It's awesome. All right, Richard, tell us a bit about yourself, your involvement with Equity, and how you got involved with the Business, Theater, and Events Committee, and then just a little intro to the MOU.
Sure. Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's delightful to see a lot of old friends and medium and potentially new friends. It's great. Thanks for participating. I started union service with Equity, I think in 03-ish, on the Central Regional Board. And actually, Business Theater was literally my first committee. And I was it's sort of a confluence of interesting events because one of the first tangible things that I did in union service was on that committee was literally the creation of the MOU. And we can get into the whys and wherefores a little bit. The rest, I've been pretty much on the CRB since then. I was on council from 13 to 18. And that's kind of all the bio that's relevant, I guess. Unless you have any other question, Matt. But I can. Do you want me to just go into the genesis right away?
Yeah, I mean, well, my next question is going to be, what's the history of the MOU? How does it work? And then what sort of work would stage managers use it in? So yeah, let's just keep moving.
Okay. So the original impetus for creating the MOU was a combination of a steep decline in the use of the regular business theater contract for what we used to call live industrials. And those of you, by the way, who've seen Bathtubs Over Broadway, that's a different type of live industrial. That was like a full boat thing. That's the kind of thing that was meant to be covered by the regular BTE, Business Theater and Events contract. The MOU was designed because we started hearing a lot from members who were doing work that were things that were trade shows. In Chicago, it's McCormick Place is the 800-pound gorilla. I guess in New York, there's the Javits Center. And, you know, a lot of cities have that, the equivalent of that. And let's say, you know, one of the car shows, all the Detroit big ones were doing it, the restaurant show, and they would hire someone to come in and say, talk about the new Dodge Spirit. I don't know, I made that up. And they come in, they do their spiel, they answer a couple of questions, learn about the car, and they get their, you know, $1,500 a day or whatever it was back then. And the employers were not interested in anything other than having that person do that gig, write them a check, and they go away, right? That was important. They didn't want to deal with contracts. They didn't want to deal with, you know, union provisions and this and that and what if. So this was never W-2 work. This was always 1099 work. Here's your check. Thank you very much. Go away. And the goal was twofold. A, to try to capture some of that work back under an equity contract for the footprint, for the, again, the organizing efforts, things like that. And the other part of it was also so that these members could have work under the contract that was good paying work. That wasn't the issue. It was just because of the nature of the beast, there was no way this was going to be on a normal equity contract. So how could we make it work? And hence the MOU was born. And the way that it was working, and frankly, this was a difference region to region for several years, which was a little unfortunate. In fact, a lot of us didn't know how other regions were treating the work. In the Central, we always had the rule, for example, that, and this is IRS considerations and things like that, that you couldn't put work that was paid on a W-2 where they took taxes out, for example, on an MOU. Always forbidden for legal reasons. I found out actually fairly recently that actually was happening in the Eastern region until, I don't know, later on, maybe Marjorie can tell me when that changed in the East, but it was recent. It was pretty darn recent. And that's a hard and fast rule, and there's legal and tax implications for why that is. But the Reader's Digest and how it works is, so let's go back to our actor who's doing the car show. He gets that check for $1,500 from his employer, and through his or her own auspices, you take that work, you have to back out certain amounts. For example, the health payment, and so there's supplemental workers' comp. You pay both ends of the taxes, for example, because when you do a normal job, you pay half of the tax and the FICA, and your employer pays half. Well, on an MOU, you are both. So you pay both ends of that. And also, by the way, the rules are a little bit different if you're incorporated, but not too different. So let's say that $1,500, you go to your paymaster, assuming that you are not a corporation that is empowered to deduct taxes. If you are, you don't have to hire a paymaster. You have that in-house. I hire a paymaster. In my case, I use Extreme Reach. There's a list of probably short of a dozen paymasters that do this work now. And years ago, we created a formula for this to happen. And the formula is, this is what has to be deducted: the health payment, the taxes, dues are taken out, but that doesn't come off the top like the other ones do. And then it becomes an equity week. The paymaster becomes the employer of record. and you call your local person in your region who deals with the MOU. At the moment, David Colin is sort of in the Central, is sort of doing the whole country because of the staff cuts involved with the pandemic. So he's very experienced with this. There is someone in New York on staff who still does some of it, but it's mostly David. And they put it into the system as an equity week. You get your check from the paymaster for your net income, and they send the health payment and the 8% pension payment to the Equity League Fund in New York, and then it becomes an equity week. That may have been a little deeper dive than you wanted at the intro, but those are the broad strokes.
No, this is great. I want to get back to the formula in a second, but I do have a question. So, what do you think happened? That why the business theater contract got phased out? Was that part of these employers and these trade shows just saying we don't want to deal with this anymore?
Yeah, pretty much. It was the big companies. It was the advertisers. It was things like the recent examples, and it's sort of had a little bit of a comeback in the last couple of years. There were two very famous examples: the Skittles show and the Oil of Olay show, both in New York, that were sort of got back to that song and dance. I mean, I cast something once that was a Sears Industrial full book musical, 2-hour full musical, 4 weeks of rehearsal, 1 performance. And this is a lot of years ago, and everybody got $2,500, whatever. I don't remember what the weekly worked out to, $6 or whatever. But companies stopped wanting to spend that kind of money on just sort of showy, cute song and dance, sales force, rah, because that was the dynamic. That was the backdrop against which that whole industry sort of grew. And all of a sudden, it became more about substance and training over, just glitz entertainment. And it fell out of favor, and the bottom fell out of that market. It's not like it went non-union. It literally, the work disappeared. Nobody was doing it anymore.
Got it. So it's not, I mean, the contract changed, but also the work itself changed.
Just disappeared.
Like before you had these large shows that would, I guess, make more sense in a, as kind of being theater adjacent. And then they were replaced with, spokespeople and narrators that would,
exactly.
Just a more, a simpler, straightforward approach. And as such went the contract. Right. That's just some history I didn't know. That's very interesting. Yeah, because I feel like I did a little bit of calculation. So it feels like if you had like a $1,500 day rate and you took taxes, dues, and health out, like you'd end up with like $800, something like that.
Oh no, more than that. It's not that big a bite. It's not that big a bite. The numbers that I know by heart are the ones that I do. I do a lot of training of attorneys, litigators specifically, and I put this work on there. So for that, just to have round numbers, and this is a couple years old now, but the numbers are easy. So $400 for a day, right? And there's it doesn't matter if it's 1 day, 2 days, it can be turned into a week, if assuming the work is within the same week, and we can get into that a little bit later on. That can be an issue with smaller amount work. But of that $400, so I bill my client $400 for that day. So the health rate, which at the time was 165, it's now gone up to 170. So they would back out the health rate. They would back out both halves of the taxes, which is about, I think, 30.4% if you add both halves of it, something like that. I can't remember.
I think so, because I think it's like 15.4 a piece.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Julie. State and federal, yes, which is why the paymaster has to be conversant with the state tax rates if they exist in multiple states, and frankly, most, if not all of them, do. So in Illinois, for example, it's been somewhere between 3 and 5% over the last 20 years. At the moment, it's 4.95. So all of that is backed out. And then you have what is the gross pay as far as the paymaster is concerned. So on that 400, the gross pay was about 172. Because don't forget, you're taking out the health payment, you're taking out 8% pension, you're taking out the taxes. So the gross rate was about 172, and I would get a check for about 148-ish, 148, 149, somewhere in there. Now, you can't just extrapolate that up because some of those are percentage costs. But for example, the health payment is a fixed cost.
Yeah.
You're not paying any more. Now it's 170 on a $400 a day contract versus a $2,000 a day contract, right? There are percentages, but not health. So it's not a straight, you can't do that math and just extrapolate up.
It's a small question. So it's like, with that much, you could do one health week. How much would it take to get a second week? Would it have to be like an especially long event, like in the amount of days? Or could you just, if you had a $1,500 paycheck, could you just cut a bunch of health weeks out of it?
As attractive as that would be, no, that's not allowed.
Okay.
It still has to take place within the same week. And where that becomes perhaps a bit problematic, especially recently, is with actors who do what's called standardized patient work, specifically. Every teaching hospital or medical school hires people to portray patients with various symptoms so the doctors get a chance to diagnose and bedside manner and blah, blah, blah. And those tend to be gigs that pay somewhere between, it could be as low as $18 an hour, going up to 40 or 50 for women, specifically for certain, for gynecological stuff. But generally it tends to be around $20 an hour. And if you don't hit the mark, the one thing you cannot do is have a zero net, a zero net gross pay.
You have to take home something.
Correct.
Okay.
So right now, the math works out that, boy, I'd have to actually do a new math, but somewhere between 350 and 400 would be the absolute minimum that would get you something, and still be a legit use of the MOU. Okay.
But to get a second health week, it'd be for
gig.
a different gig, probably.
Or if the gig stretches out.
Okay.
I have had gigs that I've done, say, 10 or 12 days in a row that I've done 2 weeks on. But that's in this kind of work, that's not common.
Okay. Great. I see some questions going into the chat. That's great.
Oh.
I have just a few more I'm gonna run over with you, and then we'll hit the chat, and then we'll open it up. Cool. So hypothetically, I'd say I did 1099 work earlier this year before the pandemic, and I just took the money and ran. But now I need the health weeks. Can I go back and run this work through a paymaster now and get health pension and dues taken out retroactively?
Unfortunately, no. Nothing can be retroactive.
Okay.
Some of this work is frequently last minute. So depending on your relationship with your paymaster, you can get it done quickly. I've done a 48-hour turnaround with the Extreme Reach office in Chicago, but that's it varies a little bit. But no, it's not retroactive.
Okay. I should have mentioned this earlier. For those who don't know, and I'm not sure if we mentioned this, David Colin's the senior business rep for the Central Region.
Sorry. Yes. Do you want me to go through the questions on the chat, Matt?
I got a couple more
Okay.
that I want to hit, and then we'll just start going through those if that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say, so how often would you say the MOU is used, and are there any new ways you think it's being utilized, or work in which it could be utilized in light of the current pandemic?
Oh, sure. I mean, the probably the biggest factor at the beginning, as I said before, is that it's got to be 1099 work. It can't be work where you're getting a check that is having taxes taken out and whoever's writing you the check is the employer. That won't fly. I don't think it's really expanded. The awareness has expanded. I don't think the categories of the kind of work have expanded so much. Now, for stage managers, it's sometimes it's this kind of industrial training work. I know it has been used by some colleagues of mine on gigs that I've done in Chicago that are corporate training for large corporations, where we do, simulations, and there's literally a stage manager calling cues and in on rehearsals and things like that. But a lot of our stage managers use it for things that need their skills but are not theater. For example, especially in New York, fashion shows are a frequent user of this kind of, and also depending on the complexity of the trade show, if it is more complex than, say, just an actor standing on a spinning car platform and talking about the car, if there's tech, if there's somebody calling cues, things like that, stage managers have been using it for that for quite some time. Trying to think of some of the other examples. The trade shows, we're trying to get it involved in the standardized patient work. That doesn't really affect you guys, so I'm not even going to talk about it. Never mind.
Okay, but so it's like stage management work, but it's industrial. You can use it.
Right. One of the rules, this is actually, hang on, one important thing. I'm sorry, Matt.
Yeah.
This is actually important. One of the aspects of the MOU that is in the text of the MOU is that it can't be used on something that could be included under an existing AEA contract. So if it's any kind of a play, anything, and it's just sort of a common sense approach as opposed to being enumerated in the contract. If it could be reasonably covered under a regular AEA contract, you cannot use the MOU for it.
Okay, so okay, yeah, okay, I think that makes sense. This is a question I thought of, just in light of the current situation, and this is a question posed as a neutral observer. We know there's a dispute between Equity and SAG-AFTRA. I'm not taking a side on that right now. What I want to know is if a thing that does, a virtual show that the actors do end up on SAG-AFTRA, the stage manager gets hired on a 1099. Do you think that could be a health week?
Yes, it absolutely could. Because, I mean, at the moment, first of all, that in a way that's sort of neither fish nor fowl. So I don't think, I mean, sort of, it depends what's about to happen in the resolution of this between the unions. But my guess would be that moving forward, especially for the contracts that have already been signed, if you can get the employer, production company, theater, whatever it would be, to, if it's a SAG-AFTRA employer, if they get paid on a 1099, you can always do it, right? Especially with these weird circumstances. However, I don't know that it's an impossibility that what ends up happening is that the actors are on a SAG-AFTRA contract, if that's already been signed, and the stage manager could be on a regular Equity contract. In the non-theater world, that happens all the time. There are multiple unions involved in a whole lot of employee situations. So I hesitate to answer that because right now that ground is changing
Yeah,
by
it's
the
like
hour,
the
if
wild,
not,
the
you know,
Wild
yeah.
West.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've gotten a couple responses in the chat where people actually try to do that thing. And per your earlier point, that stuff that could be used for theater work, like the stuff that could be AEA, it doesn't work. It seems like it's going that direction. I
Yeah,
just
well,
didn't know, so I thought it was like,
I was saying that in the context of everybody else is on an equity, you know, like a play like would be on an equity contract. This whole thing with between the two unions, that like,
Yeah.
ask me in 2 weeks.
Sure. Moving right along. What do you think is the future of the MOU, presuming a gradual return to 2019 production levels over the next 5 years?
Ideally, the use of it will continue to rise, and I think that would be as a result of the higher profile that it's getting, and the fact that, frankly, a lot of people haven't even known it existed, and it's been around now. Oh, it's going on 15 years, somewhere between 10 and 15 years, I think. I don't know, I can't remember exactly. And there are still people who have never heard of it. I mean, quite a few. I've been asked to come into liaison membership meetings and talk about it. So I'm hoping it will continue to rise, not out of a need born of pandemic eventually, but just that people know it's there more and take advantage of it more.
Sure. Yeah, and there's a part of me that thinks that kind of work may come back faster than theater for the same reason film is, making it work, because they have different resources, and there's not, there's not the giant audience component, and there's just different factors at play. Makes me think the trade shows may be able to come back quicker, but that's a theory. Great. That was all I got. We can go to some questions now.
Is there like a basic formula or calculator that folks have access to when deciding whether to take work with the MOU, or do they have to get it directly in touch? Do they have to get directly in touch with equity on a case-by-case basis?
Actually, in this case, if I'm understanding the financial basis of the question, Mary, actually, it wouldn't be, I wouldn't get in touch with equity on this. I would get in touch with your paymaster. They know the numbers. If you're putting this down to a numbers game, it would be dependent, as somebody asked earlier, on state tax rate would affect it, things like that. So if you're making the decision based on numbers, contact a paymaster who has experience with the MOU and say, if my gross check is this much, what do I net? And then you see, frankly, is turning that into an equity week going to be worth it for you in your situation?
We have another question. If you're working on an event that has prep weeks and a performance week, would that count as multiple weeks?
Sure. Yes, it would. Yes, it would. Now, keeping in mind that you would have to take your whatever check you're getting. Let's say that $1,500 check is for a 2-week gig, then it becomes 2 weeks at $750, and you have twice the bite on health weeks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on that level. Or you could treat it as one. That's up to you. But it's certainly eligible for that, sure. As long as the actual work stretches across into a second week, then that's legit.
Okay. And if it's one full day, just to clarify how many weeks of health you get, if it's one full day, you get a week of health. But if it's 3 or 4 days in the same week, you still only get 1 week of health.
Well, actually, there have been cases where people have gotten to you can get 2 weeks for the same week if it's 2 distinct jobs. in much the same way that repertory companies, you can be on a contract, or actually it wouldn't be a rep contract, but at the big theaters, for example, here, if you could be at Steppenwolf or at the Goodman, you can be performing one show at night, that's one contract, and then you're on a separate contract for the next show that you're in rehearsal for. So that's the concept. In that same way, I have had situations where it's two different employers in this case, right? Two completely distinct gigs. I did one on a Tuesday, one on a Friday. And that was 2 weeks, two completely separate things, two different employers. And that counted as 2 weeks.
But for the same employer, you would still only get one.
If you really wanted to split hairs, technically it would be the same job. If the job was completely distinct, then you could do it, but it would have to be a completely distinct job.
Okay. Switching gears just a little bit. Does the work on an MOU need to be strictly analogous to equity, like performance for actors and calling cues for stage managers? This particularly because in the virtual way we now stage manage, we're not always calling cues, or, everything's changed just a little bit.
Sure. I don't think that would disqualify anything. I mean, certainly, running a Zoom business meeting or convention, which a lot of entities are having right now, by the way, that's stage manager work. There's no reason that should not be eligible. Absolutely. Listen, you're still pushing buttons. It's just that the buttons have changed.
What is the proper use of the MOU? If you were working on a film, not this streaming situation, a film where it would completely fall under SAG, would this not fall under the ability of an MOU?
If you're working on a film as a production assistant, I don't know what the context is. It would be odd, but it would depend. I guess it would depend on.
TJ, do you want to hop on and kind of explain your question more?
Yeah, please.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, so like let's say you were doing a film that has musical numbers in it, for instance, like Smash or something, and you're calling physical cues or something like that, would that be considered eligible for MOU?
On a work level, sure, but the odds of you doing that and not being on a W-2 is thin. I'm assuming a Hollywood production company or a network or something like that. And if it's not that, if it's a skin of your teeth, my dad has a camera, I've got a barn kind of film, then the money probably wouldn't rise to the level where it would be usable. So there's no hard answer to that outside of specifics.
It feels like maybe some sort of low budget day shoot, but not too low, but not high enough to be SAG low budget. So.
Which they wouldn't pay that money for that. But yeah. Listen, at the end of the day, call your business rep. In this case, call Dave or email David Colin.
Right. And then while we've got TJ, I see the next question is, if a project is going for multiple weeks, one would be, would this be eligible for MOU, and would you also get multiple health weeks? Kind of going back to that, really understanding how many health weeks you can get out of one job.
Sure. Again, if the work legitimately stretches across multiple weeks, then yes, you could turn each of those into an equity week, keeping in mind that the percentage bite financially keeps getting stronger. Because if it's 1099, you're getting a certain amount and that's it, right? So each of that gets bitten off. Each week is a health payment, taxes, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And then Laura wants to know about symphonic performances.
That's actually an interesting question. They use they have people on. So, for example, the CSO, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, every once in a while, especially in their Christmas show, hires actors to do, cute Christmas things. I don't know what their stage management situation is. My guess is, again, it really all comes down to, are you already an employee getting a W-2? In which case, no. If you're getting a 1099, then there's no reason you couldn't put that onto a MOU.
Going back to the paymaster, we have questions about like, how do you find a paymaster? And sorry, Mary, I'm trying to find it again. There it is. Like, how do you find a list of possible paymasters? Where do you find the ones that understand arts work as opposed to other types of work that maybe use paymasters? I don't know, loan
Sure.
sharks, who uses paymasters?
There's a list of possible paymasters that has been collected by staff. Again, I believe David can forward that to you very easily. I put his email about 4 up from the bottom now. So basically I would check with staff on that.
And then while we're talking about staff, how do you get an MOU approved? Since so much of the organizing is done on our own, how do we get approval from Equity?
So there's two. So the initial process is you get a hold of, again, in this case, David. It used to be that there was a person in each region, and basically you have a conversation. Either you do it on email or you talk on the phone, or both, and determining that the work is eligible, right? Then staff puts that job into the system. So then it's kosher on the Equity side. Then you get a hold of the paymaster. Oh, right, I didn't finish the paymaster question. That was it. And then you will get a hold of your paymaster, and they will have they'll have just certain questions, and they're very cut and dried. Work start date, work stop date, what's the rate of pay, and they should be able to fill in pretty much all the rest. So yes, there's a list of paymasters who do this kind of work fairly regularly. I know Extreme Reach is one. I know that Falcon is one. Like I said, I think there's 8, 9, 10, something like that at least. It would not hurt, by the way, for you to shop around. These are not geography specific. So just because one of these doesn't have an office in your city doesn't matter, as long as they're set up and they understand the differences in the state tax situation. So they have different rates. Very common is 10% of the gross. So with a minimum, and that's the other thing. If you're doing a lower paying gig, you'll have a higher percentage taken out because let's say, let's go back to that $400 a day job example I did. My paymaster has a $50 minimum. 10% of the gross on that is 40. So if I'm only doing the one, then it would actually be 50 because that's their minimum. So that changes some of the percentages as well.
So we figured out how to get it approved by Equity. We figured out how to find our paymaster. And then how do you get the producer to sign the MOU? Once Equity is like, yes, you're good. How do you get the producer to do it?
Okay, so there are 2 avenues here. If either the producer can sign, and that, depending on the relationship that you have with that entity, that could be fine. What I never do that. I have a it's not actually a pass through because it's not a corporation, but I have a DBA registered with Cook County, so I'm doing business as Chicago Litigation Consultants, and I run it through there and it's easier for them. They'll send me a check, and then my company actually does writes the check to the paymaster. So if you have a good relationship with the producer, the MOU is actually pretty easy. It's about, there's a lot of language in there that, and I would strongly recommend that everybody look at the MOU. There's a lot of language in there on some of the what ifs. Oh, a lot of the time, especially for the corporate training work and industrial trade shows, is irrelevant. It just doesn't ever come up. The business part of the contract, where you actually fill shit out, is the last 2 pages. So it's not onerous at all, and you can approach them. If they balk, I would say do it yourself. It's actually, it takes off of their plate. And if you're at all worried about, you don't want to, if they react badly to that kind of thing, do it yourself. It's easier.
So do it yourself,
So in other words, you can have a, all right. So I invoice my client.
Mhm.
My client is, the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. I go and do a training gig. They write me a check for $1,000. I write $1,000 check to Extreme Reach.
And then you're the producer.
Chicago Litigation Consultants writes a check.
Mhm.
And I have 2 separate, I do have 2 separate bank accounts, both credit unions. I have one at Actors Federal and one at SAG-AFTRA, and I keep them separate. One is my business, one's my personal. And then Richard Shavzin gets a check from the paymaster for, $650, whatever it is. So having that sort of entity, it just saves you from going and asking the employer. A bunch of them would be fine with it and it happens all the time. And I think there's I'm pretty sure there are people on here, at least Marjorie, maybe, I don't know who. Oh, I saw somebody else on here earlier, but I think they're gone now. Maybe Vernon has been on this, but I've never bothered with it because it wouldn't have gotten a good reception, and I know that.
But by having Chicago Litigation Consultants established, the producer pays them and then they pay you. And then, the producer's also an entity you control.
Right. Yeah. No,
Okay.
it's not a corporation, and some actors, and I think some stage managers also have literally a corporation, either an S corp or some other version of it, limited, an LLC, that you can run it through then. But either way, it's the actor doing it and maintaining just a little more control, and you're not worried about pissing anybody off, quite frankly.
Is there something specific we would put in a W-9 so that the employer knows to cut the check to the paymaster?
I do it as an invoice, just on the, W-9 would absolutely work, because I do have an EIN, an FEIN, Federal Employer Identification Number, which is the corporate version of your Social Security number. And I keep that separate also. You don't have to, but I like it better. So. Oh yeah. So on the W-9, if you don't have, I'm responding just to Carolyn's last chat. If you don't have an EIN number, then you just have to fill it out with your name and your Social Security number directly, and that still works.
But then if you're filling it out, then the employer entity sends the check to you, and then you have to send it to the postmaster?
The paymaster. Yes, exactly.
The gatekeeper, the keymaster.
Yep. That's exactly what happens. Yep.
Okay. And then going back to a earlier question about COVID times, Does the job still need to fall under equity's guidelines for health and safety because we would be employed on an equity MOU?
Wow, there's a lawyer question. My instinct, and you should double check this with staff. My instinct is no, because this is a contract. It's really a code, really, or a contract exception. It's not a formal AEA contract. So those things I think legally would not obtain, as they say, but I would check with staff to make sure. But my instinct is no.
All right. I think those are all the outstanding questions in the chat.
Actually, Marjorie asked me to refer to something with Symphony. This came up with a Symphony question, although it's really opera that's more operative, but AGMA controls a lot of that work, and they hire both performers and even actors, non-singing actors in an opera on an AGMA contract. So that's a little bit of that. That may, depending on the existing collective bargaining agreements that any given entity, be it the Met or CSO or the Lyric or whatever, has, would be individual to that organization.
Just want to make sure everyone saw that Aaron Joy Swank said that guest artist contracts can also use paymasters. So the MOU is not the only time that you would give your offering to Zool.
That's true for guest artists. It's also true for special appearance. However, all of that is about to change enormously. So don't, go down that road too much, because a lot of that stuff is going to be, hopefully within not too long, be folded into a new independent theater contract that we're working on. So.
Okay. And of course, Julia, I mean, you keep saying double check with staff, always double check with staff, because it seems like we're hearing anecdotally that a lot of people are hearing no from staff, when what you've described, Richard, seems like you, were you in charge, would have said yes, as your understanding of it.
I would love an example. Julia, would you mind?
I don't actually have examples myself because it hasn't happened for me personally, but I've been hearing anecdotally about some virtual experiences. There's someone on the chat who I don't remember anymore said that they had 2 virtual trade shows or events that they were denied by staff. And I've also heard that some stage managers say, well, I wasn't calling cues, so that wasn't considered stage management work, so I was denied. So it's anecdotal for me too, and purely hearsay for me personally, but I've heard enough of it that it seems like there's a bit of a struggle there. And I'm curious about what the solid reasons are, so that the staff might have in their heads as to yay or nay.
Right. I guess my response to that would be also, how long ago was that? Because I know that there was some differentiation being made, unfortunately, region to region, which I think has been solved at this point. So people should check back with David, because he's really solid on this. And I was just seeing the exchange between Heather and Aaron. Yes. Thank you, Aaron, for backstopping me on that. You're absolutely correct. That was just about payroll companies, not the MOU.
All right. And then Pat is saying,
oh, Pat, let's see, dance company, high school.
Times when she's been told no, dance company, a high school where you're mentoring, that would be told no. That was told no by staff.
Interesting. I wonder if that was because it was teaching as opposed to, I would be just guessing as to the reasoning behind that, but Marjorie might have something. She's raising a finger.
So I think that what's happening right now is because there's no way to double check because of the COVID situation, and it's not being allowed right now because of lack of staff and being able to cover and see it. The other part of it is, but the question that somebody asked about our health and safety, I've never had that covered or asked about, as long as my employer signed the contract. And that was part of the question that I asked you, Richard, was not about the symphonies, was that I'm not a incorporated or have an EIN number. So I always have to have my employer sign that contract, but she pays me to go to the
paymaster.
to take to the paymaster.
Right.
But I have to have that third person sign that contract. So that's where a lot of us as stage managers have had problems with getting more work on the contract, on the MOU, because of having that. Now, way in the early moments of this conversation, we talked about the W-2. And the employer that I work with the most, who's totally willing to put me on contract, and I was using her paymaster, was paying me on a W-2. And that's one of the things about 2 or 3 years ago that I got stopped, because I thought I was working through her paymaster, but because I was being paid from a W-2 from her, it became an issue. If she had given me the check and I'd given that to her paymaster as a 1099, I could have still done that.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
You'd have been fine.
And so a lot of the work that's happening for stage managers is people are doing EIN numbers, right? And or have their own corporations. I'm not one of those people, so I haven't gotten to use as much the MOU as much. But as with Richard, I was one of the original people that were getting involved with the MOU and started using it as much as I could, and luckily had some employers that were willing to sign it for me.
And I see, I'm just looking at the battle discussion comments. Yeah, hopefully those days are numbered, and we'll reach a understanding sooner rather than later.
You said something about creating a new industry theater contract. I don't think I really understood. You said something before Marjorie got on about.
Oh, the ITC, Independent Theater Contract, it's being worked on in a committee, and it's basically to cover both guest artist special appearance, as well as a lot of the current DevT, developing theater situations, because they're just all over the map and we have too many damn contracts. So we're trying to do some consolidation.
And it would be promulgated?
Probably, but not 100% necessarily. I'm not on that committee, so I don't know where they're at with the details. But it would be in the same way that SPT is, just how do you herd those particular cats? Yeah, it'll probably end up being promulgated.
Promulgated, and each company will negotiate.
Yeah.
We've got another question. Working in immersive theater, which is not equity territory yet, but virtual and in-person experiences could include employment for actors and SMs, which could be in the MOU. And how do we make this easier?
Probably the first conversation would be with the producers, would be my guess. And in terms of, some some existing theaters on contracts are doing immersive. But if you're talking about like, backroom Shakespeare or, drunk Shakespeare or whatever, that is, that would start with a conversation. I'm assuming that this is all not, this is all 1099 work anyway.
Mhm.
So it's non-equity work. If it's non-equity work, then a union member couldn't do it anyway, regardless, because it's a play.
But that's what the whole MOU thing is for stage manager, is if it's non-equity work, we can't even look at it.
Right.
If it's 1099 work, we can't even be considered for it unless we put it on an MOU. So it's a dicey territory. And I happen to have a producer hat on for an immersive thing I'm trying to make happen virtually. So I want them to hire this way so that we can get our foot in the door with equity eventually. But in my case, I'm talking about a boutique little company that's going to put on this one-off thing. And it would be so analogous to the MOU or even the business theater. And how would you even get started in something that's so minute?
Right. Well, technically what happens there is that violates the if it could be on a contract thing. To be honest with you, drop David a line and see if there's any way of doing maybe a virtual version of a CAD-N.
Sure, yeah.
Something.
It's definitely not a play.
Oh.
It's definitely not. It's not. It doesn't fall in. It's a really all of these experiences that I'm talking about are like here in LA. They're doing a Stranger Things drive-in experience. They've hired performers for this. They're probably SAG, but it's that weird sort of maybe iffy place.
Fish nor fowl.
Neither here. And it feels like the right appropriate place where if someone wanted to reach out to me, and I'm not a SAG member, someone wanted to reach out to me and have me stage manage, I would want to use an MOU for it.
That sounds, I would say
Totally
I
the
would say
right
that's
thing.
it's better than drawing to an inside straight, odds wise. Drop David a line, see what he says.
Yeah, I'm curious about it because it feels like this could be, the MOU could be the start for eventual contracting and eventual organizing, but
Yep. Hang your hat on the organizing concept. Absolutely.
I don't know how much you know about AB5, Richard.
Yeah, I know.
99s and the W2s.
However, there was actually a very recent, didn't the one that was just on November 3rd lost?
That's only Uber and Lyft.
Was it specific to those companies?
Yep, their lawyers and their people, and they think it's going to help with AB5, but I doubt it.
Right. So the legal reason, and I can only go a few inches deep on this. You really want to talk to a tax attorney about the exact reasons. But what happens is you end up getting double taxed, or quadruple taxed, depending on how you're looking at it. On a W-2, there's already an employer of record, which is a legal concept that's fairly important in terms of liability. That's on one side. On the other side, you're already being taxed on it. And if you take W-2 work, so your gross pay is $500, you get a check for $325. You're then taking that $325, and well, that'd be too low, but you get my point. And then you're paying double-sided taxes on that also. And that makes the IRS's head spin for reasons that are beyond me, but it violates some federal law.
Did that answer your question, Heather? Do we need to?
No, it doesn't, but thank you.
Oh.
My question is, I understand that you could be double taxed, but instead of the theater sending that money, can't they just send it to your payroll instead of sending it in themselves? And I know nothing about whatsoever.
I believe the only way that might be able to work is if you have a corporate pass-through. Because then the employer would be hiring your corporation, and the corporation would be authorized, and there's a hoops you have to jump through to get your corporation to be authorized to be a withholding entity. So yes, it could be done that way, assuming that it is, because, well, no, because technically then you wouldn't be getting a W-2. The employer, and I don't have a pass-through, so I'm not a maven on this particular topic, but if you are a corporation and are being paid as a corporation, you know, Brad Pitt does a movie for 20 million, his pass-through corporation gets the check and then pays him. And a lot of actors do this, especially a lot of voiceover actors. So in that case, there's a way of doing it, but that involves getting paid differently than an individual would. And for that, I would recommend you talk to your accountant or you know, a tax lawyer or somebody in that area. There is a way, but it's not you know, plug and play.
Yeah, because essentially in California, there's no more gig work. Like you're either an employee or you're not. And that's a broad, generalized statement. But like, I don't know a theater right now that anyone is a gig. Even a designer, they're having to be put on payroll. And it sucks. And it's coming for y'all federally too, because, you know, California is going to lead the stupidity on this. So that, yeah. I guess my broader question is if what we have in AB5, if it goes national, which it very well could, like the MOU will have to change, you know, or we just won't be able to use it, and that will be really detrimental.
Yep, they are cracking down on the definition of it all comes down to what the definition of employee is, and you're right that if it were to happen federally, it would upend a whole lot of stuff. I'm cynical enough to think that the 28 right to work states out of 50, I don't know if that's an exact current number, but it's close, would never let that happen, at least not in the foreseeable future.
I think California is a right to work state.
What's that?
I think California is a right to work state.
Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not. No, California is union secure state.
I'm going to stay in my lane then. Thank you. Yeah.
We are coming up on our 80 minutes equity, so we're all going to need a 10-minute break soon.
I've got one question. So, and again, I'm taking a neutral position on this. I'm just curious. In like deciding whether or not this, you know, a stage manager submits something for MOU, equity is trying to decide whether it qualifies or not. Do you think like a recognized definition of stage management would be helpful in ascertaining whether something gets approved or not? Or do you think, you know, equity staff, the people that are deciding this, they're like, yeah, we know what stage management is, we approve it or we don't approve it?
My instinct is that it would be more detrimental to try to put a strong fence around that, because, I mean, you know, if nothing else, just tech changes, and so definitions of things are going to change as life moves forward. But, you know, I also think that I have to phrase this. I have to figure out how I'm going to phrase this. I think at the moment there is a good balance of empathy for members wanting to use the MOU balanced against the rules. And I think that in the past, there has maybe been an imbalance in that, depending on individuals, geography, whatever. But we're moving into a good area of people having an understanding and an appreciation of doing the work and wanting to get work on a union contract, whether it's just conceptually for being a good trade unionist, or wanting to get a couple of weeks on contract under your belt.
I think if for this particular contract and the MOU, for the business theater contract and the MOU, this is where I would say, no, let's not have a definition, because we're doing so many different areas of work in these different venues, and especially for stage managers, we're all over the place. And one of my jobs is certainly not specifically stage management. I do stage management as I go, but I also have a lot of pre-production stuff that if we had a definition, I'd get pigeonholed and not necessarily be able to work on it. When we go to our theater contracts, I think that looks at it a different way, and I'm not sure how we're going to come around and look at that as when we get to all those definitions and continue working on the stage manager definition of a stage manager.
Yeah.
The chat is continuing to talk about AB5 and its effects on independent gig work.
And don't forget, guys, this has not been tested federally to the extent that it's going to be. So whatever's going on in California right now, I would be shocked if this wasn't challenged and more generally and appealed to a very right-leaning Supreme Court, which ironically favors not AB5. So, but that was editorial, and we're a nonpartisan group.
That's okay. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but otherwise I think we're coming to the end of our conversation.
And let me all say, by the way, thank you very much for the invitation. My personal email is rshavzin@AOL. No jokes, please. I'm not changing it at this point, for Christ's sake. And happy to answer. Marjorie can also be a resource on this. And as I said, on a staff level, David Cullen is really, really good at this stuff. So, gosh, thanks, everybody. Lovely spending an evening with you all. Judy, please give my best to my hometown.